Hey everybody, my name is Ross and Citrullo.
Renan Yildizdogan.
And we're here at RHC Music Studios in Toronto, Canada. This is where we had the pleasure of mixing Samantha Martin Delta Sugar's Juno Nominated latest record, The Reckless One. Ray, do you want to talk a little bit about the inspiration, about what led us to maybe the sounds that we got on the record and sort of what brought us here?
Yeah, for sure. Reckless One is Samantha Martin Delta Sugar's third record to date, but it's actually the band's second record with featuring the 12-piece ensemble. So I guess it would be fair to say that this is more of a sophomore record for the band. In terms of influences and sounds, we didn't really go into the studio with a certain sound or an era in mind. The idea was to just kind of let the band do their thing and see which era our ears took us to for each individual song. In the process, we ended up covering a few decades, and the album ended up covering a range of influences from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I would say it's a fusion of Stax, Memphis Soul, and Muscle Shoals recordings that we all love, with Samantha's voice in the forefront. And as the record progresses, it kind of slowly shifts towards Spector's wall of sound with layered strings, background vocals, vibraphones, acoustic guitars, horns, and some other cool stuff. Really focusing on the harmonics with added elements of like funk, rock, and psychedelic soul. Love Is All Around is the opening track to the album, and it features a whole band. The drums, bass, Rhodes, and Samantha's vocals were actually recorded live off the floor. Backing vocals, 3-piece horn section, mellotron, percussions, and a bunch of other cool stuff was overdubbed after. Samantha's inspiration behind the song was, as she calls it, Bill Withers meets the Meters. I'd say in the end, it turned out to be more of a blend of the Meters meets Rare Earth with those added elements of psychedelic soul in there.
Honestly, I think we did achieve what we were going for with the inspiration, and we'd love to show you what we did when we came up with this. I think it's important to note that the source sounds that we captured, we use a lot of analog gear, so most of the sounds that we got going to the tape were already sort of where we wanted them, and then we were able to use the UAD plugins to sort of enhance what we were doing to make the sounds that we heard in our head come out of the speakers more so than what we had done. Why don't we start by listening to the track so you guys can hear a little sample of what it is that we're talking about, and then we can break down each individual instrument one by one and show you what the UAD stuff actually did for the sounds. Let's take a look.
Getting stronger.
So there, you can kind of see, what we were originally going for, and I think this kind of hits on all of the influences that we've talked about, and, I think it sounds pretty rad. Let's take a look at the drums to start, because to me, the drums, they immediately paint the picture of what you're about to hear before you've really heard too much. It starts by sounding super retro. It's very, crunchy kind of drum sound, and I'll show you how we achieved that, and then what UAD did to actually help make that even cooler. Let's flip over to our drums here, and you can see the way we captured the drum sounds. We've got the sub kick, we've got a kick out, which was actually a FET 47 by Neumann, and then we've got a hi-hat mic, our drum distortion mic, which was essentially the key to this whole drum sound that we're building off of, and then a couple of room mics that we sort of blended in for texture. But the cool thing about the way we did these drums was it was a very small, tight room, so the room mics don't really have that much depth to them either. Let's play the drums just by themselves so you can hear what they sound like isolated. Okay, so right off the bat, the majority of this drum sound is actually the kick drum, which is the sub-kick mic and the FET 47, and the drum distortion mic, which what we used was a DX77, and we threw that right between the snare and the hi-hat. So it's kind of getting that the sound of both together, but that's kind of giving us the picture of the whole kit plus the hi-hat. So if you listen to the kick drum without those, it ends up being very much isolated to just the subsection of the kit. So you can see here that on the plugins that we use for this, we have a couple of options of UAD things that we put on these two tracks to make them work together. So first of all, on the sub kick, we use the Little Labs IBP, which is a phase alignment tool. And the point of this plugin was to actually correct the phase relationship between the sub kick and the FET 47 on the front. But when we got into the mixing environment, we were able to listen in and notice that the phase wasn't perfectly aligned with the two tracks. So we use this plugin to allow us to isolate the differences in the phase discrepancies. So by using this actually helps make the kick drum sound even fuller with the sub frequencies. So this is what it was like before the Little Labs was on here. And then this is what it's like when we add that plugin to the track. So you can see that the kick drum now starts to sound a lot more round. It gives it a little bit more depth, and it sounds a little bit more 3D. And this is because both phase relationships are both pushing and pulling at the same time. Okay, then once we got the phase aligned properly with the kick drums, we then added another one of my favorite plugins by UAD, which is something that I think I have on almost every mix that I do, and this is the Voice of God, the Little Labs Voice of God. And what it does is it just sort of exaggerates and accentuates the low end frequencies that you hear from subbier tracks. So when I play this without the Voice of God, you'll hear that the sub kick is still doing what it's supposed to, but it's not as exciting. So have a listen to this without the Voice of God. And now I'm going to throw the Voice of God on. You see how it's adding much more excitement to the track. I'm actually feel like the kick drum is hitting me in the chest. The sub frequencies are very much hitting you and making you feel like you're part of the song. So that's definitely a must-have. So if you look at the kick drum bus on this track, you'll see that I've again used the Little Labs phase alignment tool. This was because I wanted to then straighten out the kick drum sounds, the combination of the sub kick and the kick out, with the drum distortion mic, which again is that RCA DX77. Ray, do you want to talk a little bit about that microphone? That was actually your idea to use the pillbox.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to use the RCA 77DX not just on the drums, but we actually ended up using it on the horns as well as the vocals and the backing vocals.
That's it.
To impart a character of that vintage sound that all those records from that era kind of utilized. So this mic actually allowed us to capture a bit of the kick, the snare, and the hi-hat all together. And it has a natural vintage sound to it because it is not directly kind of mic'd, and it's kind of up to the player to control the velocity and the dynamics of their playing.
That's a great point. It really is, in this case, it's really much about the player. The player has the ability to accentuate the snares, unlike in a traditional mic setup. So let's have a look at what this sounded like just raw. So I'm going to just bypass the plugins on here. Let's hear what it sounded like raw before we touched it with any UAD stuff. It's crispy. It's very very crunchy, but it gives you the picture of the kit. Now again, the cool thing about it is it's in mono. So the mic source here is actually just giving you drums right up the center, and along with the kick drum mic, your drums are completely in the center. So alone, it sounded like that. And then we thought, this could use a little bit more warmth. It could use a little bit more of maybe a little bit more retro vibe. So we slapped on the Studer A800. And this was used purely for tape saturation. So we wanted to give a little bit more of that warmth to it, but we still wanted it to feel like it was still keeping the raw characters of the microphone. So this is what it sounded like again before. And then when I throw the tape machine on it, it kind of does this to it. Kind of feels a little bit more
softer.
Yeah, it's like it's making it feel easier on my ears, right? And then we also thought, this microphone, it has some cool low mids and whatever, but we're sort of missing a little bit of that sharpness on the top that's going to allow the presence of this mic to cut through the mix a little bit more. And so, for me, the first thing I wanted to do was even though we recorded it with a 1073, I wanted to add another one in post here and actually bring out a little bit more of like the 4K, 5K area and try to make the drum track sing a little bit more while still maintaining its vintageness. So if you look at the 1073 that we used here, we didn't drive it at all, but we did bump up a little bit at 4.8, and we did give it a little bit of the high shelf here as well. So have a listen to this before and after. Here's the before, and here's with the plugin on top of it. There really brings out the
Yeah.
hi-hat, eh? Like
It's
that
a little
really
sparkly now.
it makes it feel a little bit more retro like that, right? So I mean, I personally think that's that's what really made the drum sound work together. So that was a good plugin to reach for. Now the other big thing that we did with the drums, and as I mentioned before, we recorded them in a small room, in a smaller drum room. So we added some room mics, which again were more about capturing the depth and sort of giving us that stereo image. What we ended up doing to sort of emulate that is we employed the Ocean Waves Studio reverb plugin, and this allowed us to, on a send, mix in some of this drum room reverb with some of the original drum sound that we had. And by using the blend of that actually allowed the drums to jump out past the 2D spectrum that we capture with the mono recording and allow the drums to actually feel wider. So if you listen to this without our drum reverb, and then I'm going to add in the drum reverb, and you'll see what that kind of does to open up the sound right here. Right, so again, without it, and then with it. So that helps to keep it feeling like it's live in a room that actually has a little bit of space to it, like as though they would be recording as a band, inside of a room of this size. So, I mean, that was sort of the goal with all of these instruments that we're going to be going through, is actually seeing, how to put each one of these elements inside of a room where they all felt like they were playing in the same space together. And now this plugin, you can use it as a remic as well. You can actually put it on top as an insert on a track and essentially remic it in that room through a series of mics. We used it as a reverb, so we were actually sending our signal, our dry signal, into it and blending that in together. And that allowed us to capture a bit more 3D image out of it. So once again, this was sort of a process that we took for a lot of the instruments in the track. So that was our drum setup that we had. So the bass was a little easier. We only had one track to contend with. We had a great bass player, and a lot of the sound that we're getting here is based on the feel of his hands. What we did was we recorded a straight DI, and we also recorded an Ampeg Sans DI, which actually gave us that dry sound with still a little bit of realism to it. So we recorded that, and we were again going for that sort of that old Motown sort of dead, dry bass sound. So we didn't want to go through an amp with it. We wanted to make it go direct into the channels. And when we brought it into the system, it already sounded pretty good by the time we got it in here. So I'm going to play it. So here's what it was. Okay. We listened to the track and we said, gee, it would be nice if it was just a little bit more compressed, and then maybe we can try to carve out some frequencies to make it sound as big as the kick drum. So the first thing we did was we pulled out the API Vision strip, the Vision channel strip, and I hit it with a touch of compression, and then I boosted a bunch of parts on the 550 EQ module. So I've boosted a little bit at 12K, I've boosted a little bit at 4K, and then I've boosted a lot 180. Okay, and then I really emphasized the low here around 50 to try to give it that little bit of woof in the same place that the voice of God was sort of lifting the kick drum. And so this helped to lock this in with the kick a lot more. So have a listen to this track without the Vision strip, and then I'll put the Vision strip in and you'll hear what that is doing. And then with the strip, right? So it's already adding more presence. It's making it feel like the bass is like, again, hitting you in the chest and complementing the kick drum. And, to me, this was great, but I felt like I still needed a little bit more than just what that plugin was adding. So I then reached for the MIDI-Q Pultec, which is, again, called the MEQ5. And this guy I used primarily to boost 300, again, and gave it another boost. And then I also boosted 1.5K with this guy, and I really boosted it. So adding this on top of it from here sounds like this. And to me, this really felt like it was adding that clarity of the track, but I was also still feeling it in my chest. And now hearing that complementing against the kick drum, these now started to lock together quite well. So let's have a listen to this against the drums. And you can see now that the two parts are actually locking together perfectly, and you're actually starting to feel them, be one unit. Next, we have our guitar. So for the guitar, we had one guitar player in the band, and he tracked live off the floor with the drum and the bass. So when we were doing this, we had the pleasure of working with UAD's aux box. It allows us to emulate different cabs in different rooms, but with the heads of the different amps that we might want to put in front of it. To a guitar player, it still feels like you're playing against a real amplifier, and with a real amplifier, and the front end of how it reacts to your fingers. But the actual output of the aux box is going to an emulator, which will then allow you to play with the speaker cabinets and put on different plugins inside of it by UAD. And it really makes live off the floor tracking like this a breeze, because you can actually have a band in a room tracking through a real amp, but there's no volume coming off the amp, just in your headphones. So in this case, we used a Fender Deluxe, and he tracked that into the aux box, which we, again, emulated the exact cab that would be in there, and we recorded the 2-track of that. We also recorded a DI just in case we needed to reamp it later, in case we missed something, but honestly, it ended up working perfectly, so we didn't have to change it. So I'd love to show you guys what we recorded on the day. This is the sound of the amp off of the aux box, like this. So this sounded already pretty good when it came off of the aux box. I felt that it needed a little bit of a lift, so I added the E channel, the SSL 4000 E channel to this track. No dynamics, just purely for the EQ for this module. And what I actually did was cut a little bit of harshness from the 10K area. I boosted a little bit around 4K. I boosted another little bit around 800, which for a solo guitar track, a guitar track that's the only one in the track, a little bit of 800 seems to go a long way to push those guitars through on top of the bass guitar. And then I did a little roll off at the bottom up me 70 hertz. So that was my EQ that I treated it with, because other than that, it sounded great right off of the track. And then after that, I felt the need to use a little bit of compression just to level the output of what I had done, to tame some of the peaks that I boosted around 4K. So here I reached for the 1176. In this case, I reached for the Legacy one. We shot out the Legacy one against the Rev A. And for this particular purposes, the Legacy one had a little bit less aggression. And for me, it made more sense to use this guy just because it was a little bit more tame, and it served the purpose quicker. So I'll show you the difference between the original track and the SSL, and then I will add the 1176 on top of that. So here's the original track right here. Okay, and then now I'm going to add the SSL to that. And then I'm going to add the 1176 to that. And you can hear that the guitar is sort of brought a little bit more to life, but the aux box already did such a great job of delivering the end result of that guitar that it didn't need a whole lot more than just a little bit of brightness. So have a listen to this with the track.
Keyboards were a lot of fun on this record. Many of the tracks on the record actually feature more than one keyboard part and instrument. The keyboard player kind of played live off the floor with the band. We then took the MIDI information from that and ran it through Arturia plugins to create our dirty Wurlitzer sound, as well as the Mellotron, which kind of kicks in during the choruses. Outside of that, we have a bit of vibraphone going through the verses. At the end of it, we still felt like it needed more keys, and in came the B3. We layered the B3 throughout the entire track.
And then once we got them in the mixing platform, we realized they needed to have a little bit more life. So that's where we reached for more of our UAD plugins. The Wurlitzer, for example, let's start there. This is the Whirly being played without any of our plugins. So I'll just go ahead and play that alone. And you can hear that it's there. It sounds dirty, right? But it still has a little bit of those frequencies popping out, and it feels like it needs to be leveled out a little bit. So we used the UA 1176 in Legacy, and we used this to basically even out the track and try to make it so it wasn't jumping out quite as much. So here is the Wurlitzer without the plugins. And then let's add the 1176. You feel how it feels a little more even, especially in the shot section. Before they felt a little sharp, they were kind of digging in at the ear a little bit. Now they're more controlled. So that's what we did with the Wurlitzer. Now the organ, as Ray was saying, actually it's primarily a feature of the chorus. So I'm just going to play us here from the pre-chorus into the chorus. And this is what it sounds like, again, without our plugins on top of it. So like this. Okay, and then what we did here again was to try to create evenness. Same plugin, same concept where we're trying to tame the top end, okay, and try to tame it so that it's not jumping out at us, out of the speakers. The same concept, we use the legacy again. Let's have a listen to the before and after. This is the before. And here is the organ with the 1176. So again, especially on places like where he's raking, that is something that's now being held and glued together using the 1176. Then we had the Mellotron. The Mellotron did sort of a similar thing as the organ in that it was padding throughout the chorus. This alone felt pretty good. So let's listen to that by itself. But what it really felt like it needed to me to make it cut over that wall of organ that we just added in the chorus was a little bit of top end. So that little bit of air that's potentially missing from this plugin. So we grabbed an EQ from a Pultec and we put the Pultec into a 16K area and just boosted that. And I ended up boosting that by 10. But I'll A/B this for you so you can actually hear the difference. So here is the Mellotron without the Pultec. And then here's what we did where we added the 16K. And without it. So it just adds that little bit of warmth from the top, that angelic quality, the air, as many people put it. And it kind of makes the Pultec stick out over top of the organ, even though they're both occupying very similar frequencies. The last one that we decided we felt we didn't have enough keys, as Ray said, we added one more thing here. This was the vibraphone now, and this is what this sounded like before we hit it with any plugins. Okay, so it still feels, it feels real, but it's got that clarity to it, right? So when I listened to this, I thought, okay, this needs to be a little bit more compressed, but it also needs to have some vibe to it. So I brought out the Fairchild, and this seemed to not only, when I drove the input pretty hard, it not only broke up in really pleasing places, but it also allowed it to compress in a way where it wasn't choking the sound at all. So it still allowed the decay of the instrument to pull out, but it tamed it in a really vibey way. So have a listen to this before, and now have a listen to it with the Fairchild. See how it kind of pulls out afterwards? The last piece of the hit, it actually like tickles the ear and almost feels like it's filtering out like a waterfall. Right? And you can see I really drove the input on this guy to make it sound correct. That's what we did for the keys.
So I think this was the first time we tried something different with the horns. We usually kind of put separate mics on each horn and kind of record it that way.
Yeah, the traditional way that we knew of doing horns was always to kind of mic up the room, mic up each horn individually, and then try to blend them all as a package. When we tried that, it didn't work.
Yeah, it just didn't sound right. And again, to try to kind of capture that vintage vibe on the record, we again used the RCA 77DX, and we pretty much put that in the middle of the room and got all three of the horn players to play all together in facing that one mic. And right off the bat, that just seemed to do the trick for me. And it was like, that's it. That's the sound we're going for. And we did crank the 1073 on it to kind of create a bit of like a natural distortion on it as well. And then you did a bunch of other stuff to it, right?
Well, that's it. I mean, when we first heard the sound of it in mono, all the horns in mono actually became a section, right? By putting them all in one mic. Now it was a section of horns instead of a wide stereo spread of horns. So when we heard that, we thought this was great, but what can we take a little bit farther? So we took the 1073 module that we were running that DX77 into, and we just cranked it a little bit more with distortion and pulled back the output. And that gave it already that vintage feel, kind of sounding like it was tearing almost. But then when you put that in the mix against the powerful vocals, not only did it cut, but it created that vintage sound. So when we got that in post, obviously there's, excessive transients that pop out when you distort something like that. So the first thing we had to do was tame those transients. So if you listen to the horns without any of our plugins on it, you'll see what they sounded like straight from the 1073 module. So obviously we needed to tame the transients a little bit. So this time I grabbed the Rev A just because I wanted it to be a little bit more aggressive. I wanted to tackle those transients a little bit harder. So as you can see here, the gain reduction is going to be quite aggressive, and that's going to allow the tail of the notes to pop out a little bit more and tame that initial attack transient that the distortion of the 1073 was bringing out. So have a listen to this. So you see how the initial attack is sort of minimized, but the tail of the track is able to pull out a little bit farther. Once we did that, then we went on our bus and we brought out another SSL channel strip. So as you can see here, I boosted at 8K to give it that little bit of piercingness to compete with the vocal at some points. So that was the horns in terms of the direct mics. But there was a magical thing that we discovered in post-production that I don't know that we were really planning on doing, but ended up kind of being the magical savior of these. Because as I put these in the mix the way they were, while the sound was correct and while they felt like they were in the right vibe and competing with the vocal, they still didn't feel like we had actually tracked these horns
in the same
as
room.
though they were in the same room beside the drummer, right? So we said, okay, well, what can we do to fix that? And obviously the Ocean Waves plugin was our go-to to fix that. So if you look at our session here, we've bussed the horns on both the horns 1 and 2 tracks. We've actually bussed them both to another Ocean Waves room. Okay, now in this Ocean Waves room was another instance of it, and this time we've used, again, the same room, the Ocean Waves room A, but with the horn preset, again, on the reverb. And what this does is this allows us to get the reflections of the room that the drums are in, but capturing them with just the isolated horns frequencies. I'm using that to blend in directly with our direct sizzle mic, and that's actually making it sound the way that we wanted to hear it, like we've been used to hearing on the Al Green records and our references. So take a listen to the horns without our reverb, and then now with our reverb. See, now they feel like they're actually living in their own space. And then now listen to that against the rest of the track and see how now they feel like they're part of it. So let's listen without the reverb to start. Okay, and now with the reverb. They feel like they're wide open now. They actually feel like they're sitting against the drums and they're in the same place as them. So every time the shots of the horns happen, that decay matches the same decay that the drums have. So to me, that felt like that really, really put the horns, in the mix and locked them in. And that was how we did our horns. Now we're on to the vocals. The vocals are arguably the most important part of any song. And for this song, and all the songs on this record, they all feature the very talented Samantha Martin. For this track, we recorded vocals using 2 microphones. We placed 2 microphones, one on top of each other, and had her sing directly into the center of both of the microphones. And so this allowed us to, in post, have the option to blend the signals between both options of the microphones. So in this case, we used the U47 and our RCA DX77.
Each one of the mics that we used had different characteristics. We ran the U47 through a 1073 BAE, and the RCA mic we ran through a Manley Vox box.
That's
and
right.
Blended it accordingly to each song.
Yeah, so each song got to have a bit of a different character because you were actually able to use parts of both microphones, right? The key to a vocal track like this is actually having the vocalist sing into the 2 microphones and basically splitting the diaphragms, putting them together so that you actually have the same vocal tone on both mics. So by doing this, we actually were able to have the choice in post-production between which flavor we wanted to go on which song.
Which varied quite a bit.
It did. I don't think any 2 songs actually had the same vocal throughout the whole thing, even though they were all tracked in the same room at the same time. They actually all have a different, unique vocal tone to them. Though, again, they're all consistently Sam, but, they all have different characters depending on the way that the sonics of that mix built up and allowed it to work. So we've got the RCA that's on the Manley is the one that we favored for this song. So this one's actually living at -3, And then the U47 is at -9. And these are both going into a mono bus and blended so that they're not clipping the input. So let me show you guys how the different mics characteristics actually worked against Sam's vocal. So this is the U47 directly.
Getting stronger, get it easier, oh, to see.
And then let's hear the RCA through the manly.
Getting stronger, get it easier, oh, to see.
To see how they really do capture different parts of the character, right? Like the RCA is really thick. It's got a lot of mids, but the U47 has this 3D quality, and it's got this, like, we pushed the 1073 a little bit, obviously, too, right? And so it's got this little bit of extra vintage warmth to it, too, right? So you can see how we kind of blended them together. Here's what they both sounded like blended together. So this is our -9 on the U47 and -3 on the RCA.
Getting stronger, get it easier, oh, to see.
Cool. So then when we got it in post, it just really needed some compression, and it needed to be evened out a little bit. The transients needed to be tamed a little bit. But most importantly, it just needed to feel like it had its own sonic vibe. And so that's where the blend came in. And once we got the blend perfect, then it was just about finding the right compressor. Okay, now obviously we had to de-ess it a little bit, so we used Massey de-esser to make that happen. But then we found our magic in the LA2. We just slapped it on without even changing anything, without even moving any of the knobs. The compressor just immediately worked. It was perfect. We just changed the peak reduction a little bit, and all of a sudden the magic was there. So let me show you what this sounds like now, the blend before the LA2 and after the LA2. So this is before.
Getting stronger, get it easier, oh, to see.
And now let's blend in with the LA2.
Getting stronger, get it easier, oh, to see.
So that really adds some magic to the track. Hey, I love that. Like everything else, we wanted to, again, capture some time-based effects to make the vocal shine against the rest of the mix. So in this case, we used 3 different types of time-based effects. We favored the UAD capital chambers, and this was a plugin that really found its way across most of the mixes. And in this particular track, we used it against the EMT 140, which was a plate reverb. So we mixed a bit of the vocals into that, as well as a delay, which we used from Sound Toys, which just added a little bit of slapback. But the most important thing has been the imaging of the solo track against a room. So making it feel like that production was actually happening inside of one room. So again, we reached for our Ocean Ways again. And you can see here that we use the vocal group, and we actually sent all of the lead vocals into this, as well as all of the background vocals, and centered them all into this to actually create that width. So it just allowed everything to be inside of the same room. So let's take a listen to the vocal track without any time-based effects.
Getting stronger, get it easier.
Now let's add in the first reverb on the capital chambers.
Love is all around you.
So immediately you hear and feel that vocal sort of surrounding you. Then let's add the EMT 140 to the same thing.
Getting stronger, get it easier.
So that kind of allows you to hear a little bit more of the 3D-ness of the effect, and it definitely sounds like a reverb that was put on purpose as opposed to a room. So it actually feels like it's adding a little bit more of the vintage character. And then of course we added the room, the Ocean Waves room.
Getting stronger, get it easier, to see.
So that's, again, adding the transients into that room and making it feel like the decay of the track is living in the same room as that, and kind of making it wider. Because, again, the early reflections are much tighter than in the other reverbs. So you hear that initially first, and then you hear the rest of the reverbs pile in afterwards. So, again, that with our slapback, that now creates the full vocal sound that you're used to hearing on the record.
Getting stronger, get it easier, to see.
The backing vocals, Samantha actually likes to call them co-vocalists, like the origins of Samantha Martin and Delta Sugar when they were a 4-piece. So for this record, obviously, we have all these instruments, extra players. It was really important for us to make sure that that spirit of the original Delta Sugar was still reflected in this record. And for this song, we actually layered quite a lot of backing vocals to kind of give it that rare earth feel. I believe we use, again, a U47 and RT77DX, but it was one mic per singer in a separate rooms.
That's it.
So it was important for us to kind of make sure that the backgrounds are as prominent in the mix as any other instrument, so that they are kind of together as a unit along with Sam and not buried in the mix. So, and that's
it. And to get that feeling with the amount of vocal tracks that we layered on this track, we couldn't treat them as a section like we did with the horns. We actually had to space these guys around the track in a stereo spectrum a little bit more. To keep all those glued together, we used the Zen limiter by Chandler Limited. Okay, now the Zen limiter also functions in compressor mode, and to do what I wanted to do with this track, I had to use it as a compressor, and I drove the input and the output with a very quick attack and an even quicker release. And this allowed it to initially tackle the transients, but also release the compression the second that the vocal track finished anything with major power. So it kind of gave the vocals a bit of a pumping feel, but when it's played in the whole mix, it actually glues all of the backing vocals together. So you end up getting this sense of unity, even though we're spatially panned around the track. So I'm going to show you guys a chorus without the Zen limiter, and then I'm going to add the Zen limiter and show you what this actually did. So actually I'm going to give you a pre-chorus and a chorus so you can hear all the vocals grooving together here. So I'll just do them soloed without the lead vocal for now.
Stronger, easier, ooh, love is all around you.
Okay, and now let's try that with the Zen limiter.
Stronger, easier, ooh.
And you can see how quickly, if you look at the gain meter here, you can see how quickly the compression releases after the attack has passed the threshold. And in the mix, that allows it to be glued against the vocal a little bit. So now let's hear that against the lead vocal, so you can hear just the vocal chain together and how they all start to glue themselves together.
Get it easier, to see love is all around you.
We also had the backing vocals stretch into the time-based effects by putting the lead vocal and the backing vocal into the same space. It effectively makes them all feel like we're sung in the same room together, and that's what together makes everything feel like they're one unit. And that's how we created all the vocals. So now the final mix. All the elements are sounding great on their own, and now what we have to do is actually bring everything together into a final mix and have it be what we hear as a 2-track that gets sent out to mastering. So the secret to what I'm doing here in this mix is I'm running everything through this SSL AWS 924 console, and then I capture the 2 mix of this console back in through the system through the Burl B2 Bomber. Now that B2 Bomber is actually connected to the Apollo, the X16, through the AES input, and at the back of that, that is actually converting on the AES clock of the Burl into the UAD system, and then that's what's actually giving me my 2 mix on the analog master bus. So the console is basically acting as a summing mixer, and it's allowing me to sum the outputs of all the stuff that we worked on in the mix in the box through the actual mixing hub of the system, and then through the Burl to capture the 2 mix on the way back in. Now on the Burl's 2 mix, I have inserted this curve bender. Okay, now this is just an EQ, and I'm doing very subtle EQ moves on here, but they're allowing me to create a little bit more presence and roll off a little bit of the low mids and boost a bit of the bass to kind of give the mix just a little bit more of a pleasing output and sort of overall carve some of the build-up that's happening in the low mids. So this curve bender, again, I'm not hitting it too hard, but it does have some really cool vibe to it. So to my ear, I really love what this is doing. So here's what this sounds like without the curve bender, and then I'll show you what it sounds like with the curve bender. So here's from the pre-chorus. Okay, now with the curve bender. And then without the curve bender. And then with the curve bender. And that's basically the entire mix. Well, there you have it. That's the record and all the tricks we pulled while we were mixing. I mean, we were very lucky to be working with a band that were all incredibly talented musicians. I mean, that really allowed us to experiment with things while we were tracking, and I think that made our job ultimately easier in the mixing process.
Yeah, and some of the plugins that we use on this record really did accentuate the characteristics of the sounds that we were going for, as well as the depth. Specifically the Capitol Chambers and Ocean Way Studios. These plugins allowed us to travel to those studios and destinations and create this vibe for the entirety of the record.
Thanks again for watching, and hopefully some of the things that we covered here will be able to be used in your productions at home.
And we want to thank Samantha Martin and Delta Sugar for allowing us to be a part of this incredible record. And don't forget to check out the record in its entirety, the Reckless One, available on all streaming platforms.
Cheers.